Hi, Angie here from Crafts at Home. Welcome back to this video series where I'm going to be featuring the art of quilting from Shape Artworks. Hopefully you will have completed up to issue 30 and I have everything stored flat ready for joining in this issue. With this issue we'll be sashing the previous 9 blocks and joining together to make another section of our quilt. You'll also be receiving the white sashing fabric. Before you begin, iron all of your fabric so it's nice and flat. It'll make it easier to work with and improve the overall finish of your quilt. Let's start marking and cutting. So now I've got everything for my white sashing marked up, I'm going to make the long cuts that need to be done. So to start with, I'm going to go along this long line here, just to cut that first section off. I'll gently move that out the way. Bring in my smaller one just to tidy up the edges. Just being very careful not to move the blocks around too much. Then I'm going to start making my cuts. There we go. Move the offcuts out of the way. I'm going to bring this one back in. And carry on cutting. Now I've actually got this fabric folded over into 4. You might want to do each of yours separately. It's entirely up to you how you want to do it. Just a case of making sure that everything is pressed down nice and firmly. Now I've got that, I'm going to gently move them round and make the final cuts. So again, along this line, take the edging off. And then with each of these cuts I'm actually cutting 4 rectangles out at a time, which is why I'm taking it extra carefully, just to make sure that I'm giving the right amount of pressure to go through all 4 layers at once, but also that nothing moves as I'm cutting, which will distort my shapes. And then finally along the edge here. And there we have it. So I'll see you in a moment. So by now we should be familiar with how to place the borders onto the squares, but I'm just going to recap how to pin on. So to start with, we just take our first little square and turn it over onto the bottom sashing. Just match your edges up. And pin that together. Then you take your side sashing over onto your block. Now I'm going to turn this over to do, so I can make sure that all of my seams are still running the right way. So you need to match your fabric up on what will be the bottom edge and work to the top. So I'm just going to pin that one in and then work up. Just be careful all the way along to make sure that all of your seams that you've ironed down stay nice and flat. And I'm going to pop a final pin in this end. And there we are. And I will actually sew with that facing up, so I can make sure as I'm sewing that all my seams do stay flat as well. So with regards to prepping each block, I'm going to leave it there. If you want to recap, you can go to either issue 11 or issue 21, and I go through pin and prep for all of the blocks and how to sew the white sashing on as well. I'll see you over at the ironing board in a moment, because we're going to pop straight to putting the blocks together. So I've just gone through and sashed all of the blocks that we'd completed in the previous 9 issues. So I've gone and done those, and the ones we will need for the next step is A4, A5 and A6. And we will also need A9 and A10. Now with A10, as you can see, it's the top block, so I've also put the top sashing onto that block as well. As well as those, you'll need B4, B5 and B6. And again, you'll also need B9 and B10. And again, because this is the top one, we've done the top sashing on that one as well. So I'm going to move A4 to 6 and B4 to 6 out of the way for now, and we're going to concentrate on the top of the block. So the first thing we need to do is put together A9 and B9. So we just fold over that join, pin together, and I'm going to pin with A9 on the top, just so I can match everything up. Now the seams on the corner here aren't matching, so they go the same way, so we just need to manually line those up neatly while keeping everything else straight as well. And we want to pop a pin in there. And then we want to join up all the edges nice and neatly. So I'm just now making sure that everything is lying nice and flat. Now that one is slightly taller, so I'm just making sure by lining up other seams. As you can see, I'll turn it over and you can see other seams that match. So I'm just going to take that first one out again and realign everything, just to make sure, because this final aligning process will really help with the overall finish of your quilt. So I'm just going to pop a pin there and then carry on aligning everything else. Just take your time at this point to make sure that you have got everything nice, matching and flat, because it is really going to make a difference when it comes to finishing your quilt. So now I've got that one done, I'll put that to the side because I'll be sewing along that seam in a moment. And then we're going to do exactly the same with B10 and A10. So again, cross over and then line everything up. I just like to fold one back because you'll notice that you've got matching seam lines on both. And if you can match them up horizontally as well as vertically, you will get everything looking a lot neater for when you've finished everything. It is just a case of taking your time, making sure the whole process is nice and neat. So I'm just going to check that way at this end and then turn it over and check that way at this end. So as you can see, I've now gone along and I've pinned all of this edge, making sure that as I turn it back, you'll see that all of the seams match up nicely. We've got the two edges there, we've got a nice centre seam going through and one of the edges. So I'm just going to go and sew along this edge and I'll see you back here in a moment. So once you've done the centre seams on A10 and B10 and A9 and B9, you then need to join the blocks together into a full block of 4. So we'll do exactly the same as we did before. We lay it out, make sure everything's nice and flat, and then flip A9 and B9 over onto A10 and B10. So we are just going to make sure that everything is lying nice and flat. I'm going to temporarily pin at this edge here where your nesting corners are. And then I'm just going to go along and make sure that as I go along everything matches. So we've got a seam there that I'm going to pin. Again, just ease it out so it's nice and flat each time you pick it up. I've got a seam there that's actually a nesting seam, so I'm just making sure that that is nesting nicely and matches. And then it goes all the way to the end. And there we go. So all we need to do now is fill in a couple more spaces where the gaps are, and just make sure again that everything is lying nice and flat and all of the seams are matching up nicely. So I'm just going to open up these seams slightly with the pins in and just make sure that everything is matching, which it is. Right, so I'm going to go and sew along this seam and I'll see you back in a moment. So as you can see, all 4 blocks now are sewn together. I've double checked along the seams and everything is matching up pretty nicely. So I'm going to take this and iron it now. So we're just going to gently iron, like we did before, along the seam. And then we want to iron it open towards the centre sashing. So, as usual, just gently iron it open. Making sure that all your seams are nice and flat and sharp. I'm just going to go back along that one. Just taking time to iron all of my blocks at this point, just to make sure that everything is lying really nicely. If you wanted to, you can remove the pins. I'm keeping mine on so I know what part of my block I'm actually getting done. And I am actually storing these hanging up. So as soon as I've got a block done, pop a couple of pins into the top and then hang it on pins in the wall. That way it's just lying nice and flat and it's not getting creased at all for when we put the quilt together. So I'm just going to go over this block here just to iron out any creases that are developed while we've been storing. Also taking off any loose pieces of thread while I'm here. Any that's come up through a seam, I'm just taking them out, making sure that everything is nice. And there we go, that is our first block of 4 that we're putting together. And now on to the next section. So the next section to this issue now, we're going to be joining these 6 blocks together to create a nice large block. So as we did before, to start with we're going to pin A4 to B4, then we're going to pin A5 to B5, and we're going to pin A6 to B6. So following the steps that we did before, I'm going to go and pin these 3 sections together and I'll see you back here in a moment. So I pinned all the pairs together and then I've sewn across those edges. Next we're going to be ironing them. So we want to iron towards the sashing. So I've placed that on top. I'm just going to set the seam and then iron open. I've already double checked that my seams are nice and straight, so that's all taken care of. So I'll just iron these. I'm just going over at the same time and making sure that all of the sashing is nice and flat, as it'll make it easier when I come to join the 3 strips together into one large one. So that's A4 and B4. And then for the last one, again, iron the strip towards the middle, and then just making sure that all the other pieces are nice and smooth. So the next thing we're going to be doing is putting the strips together. Now we've actually got the higher numbers at the top and the lower numbers at the bottom. So we want to swap round. So we've got A4, B4, A5, B5. And you just want to flip over and match all your edges up. So I'm going to start with the centre sashing here. And pin that nesting seam. I'm going to go on to the other one. And that isn't a nesting seam, but I'm still going to pin that together. I'm going to work this way, just make sure that everything is sitting nice and flat and before you pin. So I'm going to pop a pin on that seam there, and then one towards the end here, and then work back on this other seam. Again, just make sure that everything is still lying flat. Those seams match up nicely. So I'm going to pin that seam with the sashing. Pin towards the end, and then pin in the middle. There we go. Now while I'm here, I'm just going to fold that back, and I'm also going to pin A6 and B6. So I'm going to move that one just further onto the board, take this one back and over, if we just fold that one, and then we can match these. So exactly the same way, I've got those nesting seams there that I'm going to pin first. Then I'm going to go over to this one on the opposite side of the seam and pin that one. Then I'm going to go away from the sashing and pin these edges here, again making sure, just making everything lie flat before pinching between your fingers and popping a pin in. And then towards the end. I'm going to go back again to this side. First thing I'm going to check is that that seam is matching up, which it is. So I'm just going to pin that seam first. You've got a nesting seam there, so that will match quite nicely. Then I'm going to put one in the middle and one right at the end. So there we go, we've got our 2 seams now pinned. I'm just going to go and sew these and I'll be back in a moment. So now I've sewn across those 2 final seams. I have double checked and opened them up just to make sure that all the seams are meeting really nicely. So we're now going to iron all this open. Just going to set the seam on this first one, and then again we iron open towards the white sashing. Just make sure that everything is lying flat as you go. You might need to turn it over and do it a couple of times just to make sure that everything is lying perfect. And there we go, that's the first one done. Now I'm going to do the second one, so I'm just going to take it back to where that other seam is. Set the seam as we did before. And then lift and iron open. There is quite a lot of fabric now, so just beware that you're lifting it all up at one stage, just to get everything lying nice and even and flat. So there we go. That is our completed A4-B4, A5-B5 and A6-B6 section. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and the 2 sections that we now have complete. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified of our new videos. Further information about Crafts at Home, Crafts at Home Forum, the Art of Quilting and hand-shaped artworks can be found on the social media pages which are listed in the description. Don't forget to join us next week for issue 32, where we'll be making the windmill sails block. Bye for now.